Most people misunderstand empaths from the very beginning. They think empathy is softness. They think patience is weakness. But what they fail to understand is that an empath can survive emotional storms that would completely break most people long before they ever reach their limit. An empath does not walk away after one disappointment. They stay longer than they should. They listen when nobody else is willing to listen. They try to understand what others refuse to explain. Even when they are deeply hurt, their first instinct is not revenge or distance. Their first instinct is communication. An empath will spend hours replaying conversations inside their mind, searching for the exact moment things changed. They analyze words, tone, silence, and emotional energy because they genuinely believe people can grow. They believe honesty can repair damage before it becomes permanent. While others react with anger or pride, the empath reacts with reflection. They carefully choose their words because they never want to create unnecessary conflict. They simply want to be understood on a deeper emotional level. This is why so many people fail to recognize the true value of an empath during the early stages of a relationship. They mistake emotional intelligence for emotional weakness. When the empath finally speaks about pain, people often dismiss it as overthinking or sensitivity. But what most individuals never realize is that the empath is not complaining. They are trying to save the connection before it collapses. Every difficult conversation is actually an act of care. If they truly did not care, they would remain silent and emotionally disappear without explanation. The empath gives chance after chance because hope is still alive inside them. They convince themselves the other person simply does not fully understand yet. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe the explanation was unclear. Maybe things will improve tomorrow. And that hope becomes the very thing that keeps them emotionally invested long after the warning signs begin appearing. But something subtle slowly begins happening beneath the surface. Every ignored feeling leaves emotional weight behind. Every dismissed concern creates invisible distance. The empath may still smile, still support others, still appear calm from the outside, but internally they are beginning to notice painful patterns. They notice who only calls when they need something. They notice who expects understanding without ever offering it in return. They notice how often their emotional needs are pushed aside while they continue carrying everyone else. And this is where the first stage quietly becomes dangerous. Because empaths rarely explode when they are hurt. They absorb. They endure. They carry emotional burdens in silence. And because they continue showing kindness, people assume everything is perfectly fine. But the truth is far more unsettling. The empath is slowly learning that compassion without reciprocity eventually becomes emotional exhaustion. And once that realization begins, the relationship quietly enters a stage that most people never see coming until it is already too late. There comes a point in every empath's life when understanding other people starts becoming heavier than the pain they are trying to ignore. At first, the empath explains away the behavior of everyone around them. They tell themselves people are stressed, emotionally overwhelmed, wounded by the past, or simply struggling in ways nobody else can see. The empath naturally searches for hidden pain beneath cold behavior because they see emotions differently than most people do. They can sense fear behind anger, sadness behind distance, and insecurity behind harsh words. This ability to understand people is often called a gift, and in many ways it truly is. But eventually that gift begins turning into emotional self-destruction when understanding replaces healthy boundaries. The empath slowly becomes the emotional caretaker in every relationship. They manage conflicts before they explode. They absorb tension so others can stay comfortable. They smooth over misunderstandings. They become the one person everyone depends on emotionally, while quietly ignoring their own exhaustion. And the tragic part is that most people never even notice the imbalance developing. They simply become used to the empath always being available, always being patient, always being understanding no matter how emotionally draining the situation becomes. From the outside, the empath still appears calm and supportive. They still answer messages. They still listen to everyone's problems. They still show kindness even after difficult conversations. But internally, something has started changing. The emotional labor is becoming painfully one-sided. The empath begins feeling tired after certain interactions. Some conversations no longer feel emotionally safe. Instead of feeling connected afterward, they feel emotionally empty. They start needing more time alone because their energy is slowly disappearing. What makes this stage so emotionally painful is that the empath still wants to believe the best in people. They desperately want to believe effort will eventually be reciprocated. But reality slowly becomes impossible to ignore. They begin noticing who only appears when they need support. They begin recognizing who expects understanding without ever giving it back. They notice how often their feelings are pushed aside while they continue carrying everyone else emotionally. And slowly, disappointment begins growing beneath the surface. Not loud disappointment, quiet disappointment. The kind that develops after years of feeling emotionally unseen. The empath may even feel guilty for feeling this way because they naturally blame themselves before blaming anyone else. But emotional exhaustion cannot stay hidden forever. Human beings are not designed to endlessly pour emotional energy into people who never refill what they take. Yet the empath still stays. That is what makes this stage so misunderstood. Most people think staying means happiness. They think patience means everything is okay. But sometimes patience is simply the empath waiting to see whether someone will finally notice the emotional weight they have been carrying alone for far too long. Most people believe relationships begin ending when arguments become louder, more emotional, and more frequent. But the truth is often the complete opposite. Relationships usually begin ending the moment the arguments quietly disappear. And this is the stage almost nobody recognizes until it is already too late. For a very long time, the empath tried to communicate. They explained what was hurting them. They expressed concerns carefully and respectfully. They tried to create emotional understanding before distance became permanent. But eventually something begins changing deep inside them. The conversations become shorter. The emotional reactions become smaller. The empath slowly stops explaining themselves the way they once did. And the silence that follows is often misunderstood as peace. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is emotional withdrawal happening in real time. The empath slowly stops fighting for things they no longer believe can change. They stop repeating conversations that never lead anywhere. They stop asking for effort from people who consistently refuse to give it. And because the conflict disappears, many people assume the relationship is finally stable again. They think the empath has accepted the situation. They think the problem is gone. What they fail to realize is that the empath is quietly detaching emotionally while still physically remaining present. This stage is incredibly dangerous because it does not look dramatic from the outside. The empath still behaves politely. They still respond to messages. They still participate in conversations. But internally, hope is beginning to disappear. And hope was always the force keeping them emotionally invested through all the pain, disappointment, and exhaustion. The empath starts reclaiming their emotional energy little by little. They stop obsessing over unanswered messages. They stop replaying conversations late at night, searching for hidden meaning. They stop wondering why someone failed to show up emotionally. The emotional focus that once revolved around saving the relationship slowly begins returning back to themselves. This emotional shift confuses many people because the empath does not suddenly become cold or cruel. They simply become quieter. Their energy changes. Their warmth becomes less automatic. Their emotional availability begins fading. And the most painful part is that many people only notice the empath's value once they feel that emotional distance growing between them. Suddenly the attention appears. Suddenly the concern appears. Suddenly the effort that was missing for years begins showing up. But timing matters more than people realize. The empath already spent months, sometimes years, trying to save the connection before reaching this point. They already carried the emotional burden almost entirely alone for too long. And by the time others finally begin fighting for the relationship, the empath may already be emotionally somewhere else. This is why the final stages feel shocking to so many people. They mistake patience for permanence. They mistake forgiveness for endless tolerance. They assume the empath will always stay because the empath always stayed before. But human beings naturally become blind to what feels permanent. When someone is endlessly available, their presence starts feeling guaranteed instead of appreciated. The empath notices all of this quietly. They simply stop speaking about it. And eventually, that silence becomes louder than any argument ever was. The final stage of an empath's patience is not rage. It is not revenge. It is not emotional chaos the way most people expect. In fact, the most powerful transformation an empath experiences often happens in complete silence. By the time others notice something has changed, the emotional connection may already be disappearing beneath the surface. This stage usually arrives after years of emotional exhaustion, after countless attempts to repair what only one person was trying to save, after endless nights spent carrying emotional burdens that were never meant to belong to them. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where they simply cannot continue pouring energy into empty spaces anymore. And when this shift finally happens, it changes everything. At first, the signs are extremely subtle. The empath stops checking their phone constantly. They stop waiting for messages with the same emotional urgency. They stop wondering why someone failed to show up emotionally yet again. The emotional attachment that once controlled so much of their energy slowly begins fading away. Not because they suddenly stopped caring overnight, but because disappointment has finally outweighed hope. And hope was always the reason they stayed. This is what makes emotional detachment so different from anger. Angry people are still emotionally invested. Anger still contains attachment. Angry people still want understanding, accountability, or change. But detachment no longer fights for those things. Detachment no longer chases explanations. The empath stops needing validation from people who repeatedly failed to value them emotionally. And once this happens, the emotional bond quietly begins breaking apart from the inside. What makes this stage so unsettling is how calm it appears from the outside. There is no dramatic confrontation, no desperate final speech, no emotional explosion announcing the end. Just distance, quiet distance. The kind of emotional distance that develops after countless failed attempts to repair something alone. Many people completely misunderstand this calmness. They think the empath has finally accepted the situation. They think the relationship is finally stable again because the arguments disappeared. But emotionally, the relationship may already be over inside the empath's mind. They processed the grief long before anyone else realized there was even a problem. The empath begins understanding something life-changing during this stage. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Understanding someone does not mean tolerating endless emotional neglect. Patience should never demand abandoning yourself completely just to keep another person comfortable. This realization creates peace inside them. Painful peace, but peace nonetheless. The empath no longer wakes up expecting people to suddenly change. They no longer build emotional futures around promises that repeatedly failed to become reality. They stop carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to hold in the first place. Slowly, their energy begins returning to themselves for the first time in years. And this is why detached empaths feel completely different. They are no longer trying to convince anyone of their worth. They are no longer begging to be heard. They simply let go quietly. And once an empath truly reaches this stage, there is often nothing left to fight for anymore because emotionally, they already said goodbye long before anyone else realized it was happening. Human beings have a strange psychological habit. They often realize the true value of something only after they begin losing access to it. And nowhere is this pattern more visible than in relationships with empaths. For years, people become comfortable with the empath's patience, comfortable with the forgiveness, comfortable with the emotional support that always seems available no matter how badly they behave. The empath continues showing up, continues understanding, continues carrying emotional weight that nobody else wants to hold. And over time, others slowly stop noticing how extraordinary that consistency truly is. The empath becomes emotionally predictable, always available, always patient, always understanding. And because of that, people unconsciously begin treating their presence as permanent instead of valuable. Then one day something changes. The calls become less frequent. The emotional warmth begins fading. The empath no longer rushes to rescue everyone emotionally. Their energy starts shifting somewhere else, and suddenly people begin feeling something they never expected before: absence. Now the effort appears. Now the concern suddenly becomes urgent. Now the conversations people avoided for years finally feel important. But the painful truth is that this realization often arrives far too late. The empath already spent years communicating their emotional needs. The warnings were there. The difficult conversations were there. The opportunities for change existed over and over again before this moment ever arrived. But because the empath remained patient for so long, people assumed they always would. They mistook kindness for permanence. They mistook forgiveness for endless tolerance. They mistook understanding for unconditional access. This creates one of the most painful emotional dynamics in human behavior. One person becomes more emotionally invested precisely when the other becomes emotionally detached. One finally sees the value, while the other has stopped searching for validation entirely. And this is why the empath's final goodbye feels so shocking to people. Not because it happened suddenly, but because they noticed it too late. The empath is not trying to punish anyone during this stage. They are not obsessed with revenge or proving who was right. In fact, they are usually emotionally exhausted by conflict itself. What they truly want now is peace, stability, emotional safety, a life where they no longer have to abandon themselves just to keep others emotionally comfortable. This is the moment many people finally understand something they ignored for years. The empath's kindness was never weakness. Their patience was never infinite. Their willingness to stay was never guaranteed forever. The empath simply loved deeply, and deep love often comes with deep endurance. But even the strongest emotional endurance eventually reaches a limit. By this stage, the empath no longer measures their worth through someone else's effort. They no longer chase explanations. They no longer wait endlessly for emotional reciprocity that may never arrive. Something inside them has fundamentally changed. The emotional chapter that once consumed so much of their life is finally losing its power over them. And perhaps the most powerful part of all this is how quietly it happens. The empath does not always announce their emotional departure with dramatic words. Sometimes they simply stop carrying what was slowly destroying them. Sometimes healing does not look like fighting harder. Sometimes healing looks like finally putting the emotional burden down and walking away in complete silence. An empath does not suddenly wake up one morning and decide to stop caring. That is what so many people fail to understand. The ending is usually slow, quiet, and emotionally exhausting. It happens beneath years of patience, sacrifice, emotional labor, and silent disappointment. Long before the empath physically walks away, they have already been fighting an internal battle that nobody else could see. At the beginning, they tried to understand everyone. They listened when others refused to listen. They stayed during moments when most people would have already left. They gave chances that nobody else would have given. They convinced themselves that patience, love, and understanding would eventually create change. But over time, the emotional weight became heavier. The effort became painfully one-sided. And slowly, the empath started losing pieces of themselves while trying to hold everything together alone. Then came the silence, the stage that most people completely misunderstand. The empath stopped arguing, stopped begging to be understood, stopped explaining emotions to people who only listened when it benefited them. And eventually they realized something life-changing. Understanding someone does not mean sacrificing yourself for them forever. Compassion should never require emotional self-destruction. That realization changes the empath forever. For the first time in a very long time, they begin choosing peace over emotional chaos. They stop chasing validation from people who repeatedly made them feel invisible. They stop carrying emotional responsibilities that never truly belong to them. They stop trying to fix people who refuse to acknowledge the damage they create. And little by little, their energy finally starts returning to themselves. This final stage is not bitterness. It is clarity. The empath finally understands that kindness without boundaries becomes suffering. Love without reciprocity becomes emotional exhaustion. And patience without respect eventually destroys the person giving it. For the first time in years, the empath begins reconnecting with themselves instead of constantly focusing on everyone else's emotional needs. They sleep more peacefully. They stop replaying conversations in their mind every night. They stop waiting for apologies that may never come. They stop searching for closure from people emotionally incapable of providing it. And perhaps the most powerful transformation of all is this. The empath no longer feels guilty for choosing themselves. That guilt once kept them trapped inside unhealthy emotional cycles for years. It convinced them that leaving meant failure. But now they understand something deeper. Sometimes the healthiest thing a person can do is walk away from environments where their compassion is endlessly consumed but rarely respected. This is where true emotional freedom begins. Not through revenge, not through anger, but through acceptance. Acceptance that some people never change no matter how deeply they are understood. Acceptance that not every relationship can be repaired through effort alone. Acceptance that understanding someone does not obligate you to abandon your own emotional well-being forever. And once the empath reaches this understanding, they become emotionally untouchable in a way they never were before. Because now they know the difference between helping someone and losing themselves trying to save them. That is the final transformation. The empath who once spent years chasing understanding finally understands themselves. And in that moment, the quietest ending becomes the most powerful beginning of all.